Well, I made a recording all about the expanded universe, and the file got corrupted. It had some kind of weird noise. I think maybe my headset that I was wearing, I think the wire's going bad. I wear it a lot more, obviously, now that I'm working from home and have it on at least half of the day. Anyway, the expanded universe, or EU, as it's usually more commonly called because it's easier to say and write. What exactly is it? I think that it's changed just recently, not only what people consider it to be, but also what people think about it. And I think that there is a schism right now between a fairly large subset of the fan base and Disney, who owns the franchise now. And then, of course, I think even within Disney, there are schisms. I think there's the people who follow the Kathleen Kennedy model, and then there's the people who are kind of the old-time fans who are dismayed at what Kathleen Kennedy has done to Star Wars. So the expanded universe, in short, prior to Disney buying the brand, was the setting and plots and characters as they had been expanded beyond the movies and other official products. Now, the books were, of course, official, but they were licensed and run by a different organization, and they're less official than the movies, which in turn were less official which in turn were more official. They were the most official. They were the top level of canon, that everything that was in a movie was considered to be true, even though, quite honestly, the movies started to contradict themselves over time, even before the sequel trilogy came out. Below that, in terms of canonicity, were the TV shows, which really kind of meant the Clone Wars animated show, the now 7-season animated show. And then below that were, a vast array of other products, video games, novels, comic books, and more. And even within that, there were gradations of canonicity because stuff got overwritten by other stuff. Now, it's a little tricky to say when does the EU start. Some people say Splinter in the Mind's Eye, the first tie-in novel, which was commissioned by George Lucas and given to Alan Dean Foster, who ghost wrote the novelization of the first movie. He wrote Splinter in the Mind's Eye before the movie even came out, under very close supervision of George Lucas, although Alan Dean Foster did write it. It was not based on a Lucas story, but Lucas then kind of reviewed everything in it and actually made some changes. It was written in part because George Lucas was feeling pessimistic as the movie was working up towards launch, and he wasn't sure how successful it was going to be, and he wanted to make a sequel to it, but he wasn't sure how successful it was going to be. So he deliberately had Splinter in the Mind's Eye structured in such a way that it could be a cheap sequel, reusing many of the sets and props and whatnot, and otherwise kind of being filmed in a way that wasn't going to cost a lot of money, wasn't going to have a lot of big set-piece special effects scenes and stuff like that. What happened, of course, was that Star Wars was a huge hit, and the Splinter in the Mind's Eye sequel got abandoned in favor of what became, of course, The Empire Strikes Back, which was the actual sequel. But before Empire Strikes Back was the sequel to Star Wars, Splinter in the Mind's Eye was the sequel to Star Wars. And it's interesting to go back and read that now and see what might have been. There were some other spin-off things that came out of similar vintage. There was a trilogy of Han Solo novels that were written after the first Star Wars, but before The Empire Strikes Back. And, they kind of, Tim Daly, I think, they kind of go off in a different direction that feels in many ways more like a traditional space opera, and it doesn't yet have a lot of the specific Star Warsian things in it, and that's a little tricky to quantify, but I think that as Star Wars developed, it kind of eventually developed its own feel and mood and certain ticks that made it different than any other generic space opera that had been written, even though Star Wars deliberately mimicked much of that space opera. But it developed its own thing, and the Tim Daly the Tim Daly Han Solo novels don't yet have that, so it's a kind of an interesting thing to watch too. There were also some unusual things that came out kind of at this early stage that George Lucas has either disavowed or studiously ignored. Most famously, of course, was the holiday special that came out in the late 70s and is famous for being absolutely terrible. But there was some other stuff that was equally terrible. There were some live-action Ewok movies with Ewoks finding some lost little kids running around in the woods, and it's kind of like the creators of that particular film were marketing it for a different audience. They were direct to TV, and I think they thought, hey, kids will eat this up, and even though the story and the movie making is going to be subpar, we'll make up for it by just having Ewok and kids, so there'll just be an overload of cuteness, and that'll be fine. Most people don't remember these anymore, and deservedly so. They're really not very good. I don't consider any of this stuff the EU, because once the EU really kind of started, it ignored all of this, and most of what this stuff had actually done, either it has no bearing whatsoever on anything that followed, or it was in fact overwritten by what followed. Splinter in the Mind's Eye, most famously, was headed off in a different direction. Han Solo doesn't even make an appearance. He's not even named. He's referred to indirectly as a pirate and smuggler that Luke once knew. And of course, there's all these flirty, budding romance scenes between Luke and Leia in that novel, which really kind of tells you, of course, that some of the developments that came out later in the original trilogy were not originally part of the plan at all. And I talked about that a little bit in my last video. So the EU really started in a form that's recognizable to us today with the Timothy Zahn trilogy of books. Oh, and I forgot, they were also a big run of Marvel comics that were actually quite successful, and they're credited with potentially saving Marvel from bankruptcy. And they started shortly after the release of Star Wars. They came out throughout the rest of the late 70s, and they ran for a number of years. Those are also kind of ignored, and I'm not sure why. But I think there's a lot of stuff that's cherry-picked out of there from time to time. And in fact, there's a lot of stuff that's cherry-picked out of this stuff that has been wiped out and by other things that superseded it. A lot of other little details have been cherry-picked out of it, and I think that that's just kind of the nature of it. The creators like to go back to that kind of stuff and say, hey, here's some stuff that was cool that now isn't accurate, but let's find a way to bring it back in. This actually, unfortunately, they brought a bunch of stuff that wasn't cool. The expanded universe, which is, much like any other type of franchise where they, had writers for hire, for diverse background. Lots of different people have written lots of different things for Star Wars over the years. And there's some really good stuff, but there's an awful lot that isn't very good. And an awful lot that, if you ignore it, you're not missing much. And there's a lot of stuff that was superseded. George Lucas famously didn't really pay attention to what was going on in the EU. And as he made new stuff, both in the movies that he made, the prequel movies, and as he kind of directed the Clone Wars, he overwrote stuff in the EU all the time. I actually got kind of a perverse pleasure of watching things that I didn't like get overwritten. I thought it was kind of funny. For example, the Mandalorians. When Lucas first, introduced the character of Boba Fett, although he didn't ever say this in film, he had kind of, told people that, and he was on the record as commenting, behind the scenes, that Boba Fett was an Imperial shock trooper who had fought the Jedi and been defeated by them in the Clone Wars, and he was kind of one of the last ones left. He had kind of, with the disintegration of his army, he kind of just went solo, became a bounty hunter, and that was kind of supposed to be the original origin of what later became the Mandalorians. Because Boba Fett was such a popular character, the EU decided to make all kinds of stuff with him, and that was one of the sad things that the EU often did, is that it would take a Boba Fett doesn't really count. He was a popular and relatively significant character, but often they would take a very minor character and then just expand on it, and it kind of felt like minutia that didn't matter very much. And it's kind of like, was this really worth doing? Did this need to be done? Did we really need the story of, this one extra that we spot in the crowd scene of, whatever? And that's often kind of what the EU did, and it was unfortunate because it kind of cheapened those stories. But as the Mandalorians, as they developed, they kind of had come up with this whole weird culture for the Mandalorians. They weren't a race. They were supposed to be, this culture, and anybody who, did the proper rituals, had the proper training, went through the proper, gauntlet of trials and whatever, could become a Mandalorian. And they were this multi-species, multi-ethnic, diversity is our strength, weirdness in terms of, this military group. And it was kind of strange, and they kind of didn't make any sense, and they had these ideas of honor that nobody, no culture has ever had any ideas quite like that, for a variety of really good reasons, because they're supremely impractical. And, there was not necessarily tons of terrible ideas there, but there was some that I kind of thought, this was cooler when I didn't know what the Mandalorians were supposed to be, or the Super Commando, as they sometimes called it, or the Shock Trooper. It was cooler when they developed it. It actually wasn't as cool. In the Clone Wars series, George Lucas decided to feature the Mandalorians quite heavily. And now, George Lucas didn't write the Clone Wars. He didn't direct any episodes of the Clone Wars, but he oversaw the stories to a great degree, and he would bring stories to the team and said, you're going to make an episode or a series of episodes about this, and this is going to be the theme, and this is what's going to happen, and he's going to give it to a screenwriter, and he's going to write it. And it really kind of is George's continued vision most of the time. And what we saw, that what George thought the Mandalorians was nothing at all like what the EU thought they were. And he decided that, yes, they were a planet, they were a human ethnic group, they kind of looked like these Nordic space Spartans. And curiously, one of their two home planets, there's Mandalore, of course, and then there was Kalevala, which is a Finnish word, and it refers to, a Finnish work of epic mythological poetry, kind of like the Iliad or the Odyssey of Finland. So, curiously, they kind of look like Finns, which was kind of also interesting. But this undid much of what the EU had done about Mandalorians, and because the Mandalorians had been very popular, this was a bit of a blow to people who really liked the EU version of it. In fact, one of the interesting things that George Lucas specifically did, and he specifically had and insisted that this line be present from one of the Mandalorians, is that they insisted that Jango Fett was not a Mandalorian. They didn't know how he had the Mandalorian armor, and they presumed that he was some kind of thief and scoundrel. Boba Fett, of course, had absolutely no connection to the Mandalorian culture at all. He was merely a clone of Jango who grew up as a bounty hunter and happened to have some of that armor as well. So now this whole body of work about the Mandalorians, George Lucas said, no, that's not my vision of Mandalorians at all. Of course, then George Lucas went and sold Star Wars franchise, and a lot of the people who had to work with it were fans of the EU and tried to work stuff back into the EU, or back into the canon that had been in the EU, regardless of whether or not George Lucas had ever approved it or if it was his vision at all. So when we see the Mandalorian show that's come out recently, which most Star Wars fans, of course, have seen, they made a more major changes to the Mandalorians. They first went back to the idea that there's no such thing as a Mandalorian race. They were not a distinct population. Anybody could become a Mandalorian through some kind of adoption as foundlings, which isn't necessarily a dumb idea. And maybe that there can be some kind of where they work that into the lore in a way that makes sense, like after being devastated in the wars, their population was really low. It was the only way that they could maintain themselves with enough fighting force to be viable was to adopt foundlings. I don't know, maybe they could do something like that, but maybe they didn't. And the other thing, they made up this whole rule about helmets, that they never take their helmets off, which is absurd because in the Clone Wars and in Rebels, they took their helmets off all the time. And we saw them frequently without their helmets on, and they didn't bother them in the least to take their helmets off. So I don't know where that idea came from either, or what we're supposed to make of it. I kind of like to imagine myself, and this is where I kind of say that I think that it's impossible to keep this stuff straight if you're a fan. You kind of have to pick and choose what you want to think is correct and ignore what you don't. So which version of the Mandalorians is correct? The version of the Mandalorian, or the version of that George Lucas himself detailed, which is in the Clone Wars, or the version that, in Rebels, which is kind of a hybrid. It's kind of headed it's a little bit of both. I don't know. I kind of prefer the Clone Wars version myself, although I can maybe imagine that the Mandalorians of the Mandalorian, which take place a number of years, a generation or two at least after the Clone Wars, maybe there's some kind of radical religious sect that spun off in the wake of the disasters that struck Mandalorian society. So, I guess they don't have to necessarily be mutually exclusive, but the fact that they're so different is kind of weird. And all of this, of course, the expanded universe officially doesn't exist anymore. Disney decided at some point early on that they were going to wipe it all out. They were going to call it all Legends. They're going to still keep it. They're actually still republishing some of the books, like Timothy Zahn has been republished in mass market paperback with new covers. But they bear the Disney logo. They decided, we'll still try to make some money off of this, but we're not going to be bound by it. And they said none of this is real. The only thing that's real is the movies and the TV show and the other TV shows that we're coming out with. And the rest of the stuff, like I said, it's kind of funny. You see that old-timey Star Wars fans in the production group or in Lucasfilm are sneaking in some of their favorite things over time into the show, which is into the franchise. Anyway, that's kind of my talk on the EU. I have mixed feelings about it. I think that there's some of the stuff's really great. Definitely read the Timothy Zahn trilogy. I think the BioWare Old Republic stuff, there's 3 games there. I think they're all excellent. I'll talk more about Old Republic soon because I'm kind of really big into playing it right now. I think Force Unleashed and a few other things are really good, but much of it is missable, and you're not going to feel too sad that if you miss it. So anyway, next time we'll hit the sequel trilogy and go from there.